Okay.
You see me?
Yes.
Okay, long time no see. Sorry.
All
All right.
right. Ready? I think we're ready to go. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this awesome panel. We've got a really all-star group here today, so I'm super excited to dig into some of these issues with everyone. So the title of the panel, Combating Systemic Bias in AI Systems, Where We Stand and Where We're Going. My name is Aaina Agarwal. I am a human rights lawyer and I focus on AI and Web3 tech. Oh, I'm also the host of the Indivisible AI podcast. So, before we jump into some of the questions around AI, ethics, and bias, I really want to make sure that the audience gets a sense of who our panelists are and specifically the work that they're doing. So I'm going to start off one by one, asking each of our panelists a couple questions about their work, and then we'll jump into a broader discussion on bias and bias mitigation. So let's start with Olivia. Olivia Gambelin, the founder of Ethical Intelligence. So, hi, Olivia.
Hi.
I'd love if you could help the audience get a sense of what ethical intelligence does. Based on my research, what I understand is that, in short, you offer ethics as a service, so people can think of SaaS or software as a service, but bringing that model to ethics and in the commercial sector for AI development. So walk us through that offering and your strategic approach.
Yeah, absolutely. So I usually say we're an AI ethics advisory firm, and we have more or less two tracks. One track, we focus on the training of individuals, the training of employees. For the fellow philosophers, we're a virtue ethics firm. We focus on virtue ethics, but we try and train employees in the skill set they need to both identify situations as being ethically charged, of needing ethics to help with decision making, and then the frameworks and the methodologies that then come off of those decisions that help you walk through those decisions. So that's more of the training aspect. And then on the other side, which is again focused on ethics as a service, we take the approach that ethics is a tool. So we work on data strategies, we work on product roadmaps, we work on business models. But what we do is we use ethics as a tool to spot risk areas, help mitigate that risk, and then also flip it. We also use ethics to spot and develop different angles for innovation. What I like to tell founders, we work actually primarily with startups and SMEs. What I like to tell founders is we're there to help ensure that the mission of your company is realized throughout the growth of your technology.
Very, very interesting and much needed in this space. One follow-up question I have there is, how do you think about the exercise or the offering differently depending on whether the client is a startup or a larger company? And related to that is that division the most appropriate for considering kind of a different approach, or would you base it more on application or industry rather than company size?
That is a fantastic question. We actually, when Ethical Intelligence was first started, we mainly worked with big enterprise, and we were working on things like protocols, frameworks, governance systems. It was very top-down heavy. It was very, how does management follow and track these changes and the decisions that are made? When you're working with startups and SMEs, the smaller companies, that's kind of top-down governance, those frameworks are stifling. They get in the way. Now, I'm not saying ethics gets in the way at all. What I'm saying is you need a different perspective in terms of ethics. You actually need it at the forefront of your mind so that the decisions that you're making, you can make them on the spot, but you have the proper training, you have the proper skill set already in place. So instead of going, okay, I've checked these 3 boxes, you are walking into situations thinking, okay, have I checked for our different values that we know as a company and as a society that we want to build and make decisions off of? It's just a different perspective. With big enterprise, it's again more process heavy, where with startups especially, you're looking at really bootstrapping half the time, but they're looking at the key decisions and the products very, very early on stages that will change the outcome of the product massively over time. And so it's a different perspective. A lot of the resources that exist in the AI ethics space are targeted at big enterprise. So what happens is startups will sit there, and especially founders will sit there and feel overwhelmed by, I can't possibly take all this time to do all these different steps and all these different frameworks and all these different principles. So instead we switch and we go, okay, well, what are your company values? And how do you make decisions based off of your company values?
Yeah, and I imagine there's also a real opportunity there because you're getting to work with companies early on. And so how bias and bias mitigation ends up playing out throughout the life cycle of the AI product or service is going to be different when you have the opportunity to get in at the ground floor. And so that's something that we're going to talk about a little bit later on when we think about just the exercise of identifying and mitigating bias relative to where we are in the life cycle of an AI. So next, let's meet Jay. Jay Budzik is the CTO of Zest AI. And so this is interesting. In a piece authored by you, you wrote, quote, "The application of machine learning to credit offers a once-in-a-generation opportunity to safely expand access to economic opportunity and address the severe economic inequality in the United States and everywhere." So that's fantastic, and I think is important to highlight where there really is an opportunity when we talk about AI. But on the converse side, so allocating credit and using credit history has typically been seen as a practice that people might identify as potentially predatory or discriminatory. And it seems you guys are coming in and looking to disrupt that explicitly on the basis of AI that can be more equitable and inclusive in lending. So I'd love to ask and give everyone a sense of how you align Zest to leverage AI as part of the solution rather than the problem. And I think that here, tracking back to a common theme within AI, is that it's brought in on the promise of doing things better. On solving for a lot of the challenges that have hindered analog application. And all of that sounds really good. But, of course, there's also the fact that if it's not done right, then it can actually serve to exacerbate that existing challenge in a way that is infinitely more problematic. So given all of that set up, would love to hear how you're thinking about the alignment with the opportunity side.
Thanks so much. And I really do believe that we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to change things for the better, and that responsible AI is the key. And kind of one of the things that we know in financial services is that lending decisions are often made based on your history or a person's history with a credit product, and those histories are recorded at the credit bureaus, and they're used to make models that make decisions about whether or not people are allowed to buy a home or get a car or get a student loan. And those models, because they're based on that history, reflect the bias in that history. And so we know that for generations, the banking industry has had practices that have not been friendly to women or people of color or immigrants. And as a result, the data that the models are built on have that bias baked into them. And so the question becomes, what can we do about it and how do we make progress? And so we've developed a series of technologies that allow us to see into the models, see how they're treating people differently, why people are getting different credit scores, why people are getting approved or denied at different rates. And then not just stopping there, asking the question, well, how can I mitigate that bias in the models and make an outcome that's fair for everyone? And it's kind of important to realize that there's two ways of looking at fairness in the context of financial services, at least from our perspective. One is equity and access, so making sure that people are getting access to funding at a similar rate. but also that the people who do end up with access actually have the ability to repay. Because we would hate to equalize things and then create a situation where people are getting loans that they can't repay and they're trapped in a cycle of debt. And so it's really important that we take multiple perspectives when we're looking at a question of fairness and responsibility when applying these algorithms in financial services.
Yeah, very, very important. And I think it's great that you've sort of highlighted the multiple interests that are valid and that need to be considered from either an ethical or a human rights perspective when you're thinking about how you might, in a positive manner, disrupt lending with respect to AI. So next, let's meet our panelist X. And X, you'll have to help me out here. How do you pronounce your last name? Is it Eyeé?
Yeah, it's Eyeé, like yippee-yi-yay.
Okay, awesome. Eyeé. And so X is a product manager at Google, prior to which she held a number of roles focused on responsible innovation and fairness and ethics in machine learning. So X, can you talk to us about your role with respect to AI ethics at Google, what you're doing now, maybe relative to where you started out at the company? And also, I'd love to hear about that in conjunction with the journey that Google's taken from 2017 and coming out with its principles on AI ethics to 2020, the more recent guidance on governance principles that are intended to implement governance processes that are intended to implement those principles in practice.
Yeah, for sure. So when Google, I was a burned out developer leaving Microsoft, where I was working on blockchain, AI, and IoT. And I really just wanted to put my brain towards solving a problem that didn't require me to be in front of my computer for 20 hours. And so someone told me about this team at Google where I could do that and do good. And it was the machine learning fairness team at Google. So when I joined the machine learning fairness team, my role there was really to look at how do we even define when something's unfair? What do we do when we find a challenge of fairness that there is no computational solution for? Who are the right researchers that we need to pull in to start to answer some of those novel questions? What's the right expertise we need to be asking? What's the right expertise we need to have present, or the right questions we need to be asking to ensure that we're even evaluating some of these systems that come to us for consultations properly, to be able to actually assess risk. What is assessing risk even? And so out of that team, that's where you get research papers like model cards. You get, the research paper around auditing and algorithmic fairness. So looking at risk assessment frameworks and AI, all that kind of spurred out of the ML fairness team at Google. Shortly after that, I moved up to responsible innovation, where I actually built out some of those governance processes around how do we review everything. Like if we're saying across the board that these AI principles are not just something we're sticking in a blog post in their marketing campaign, but they are the actual principles by which we will and will not conduct ourselves in relationship with AI, either externally with any partner. How do we make sure that that's happening? And so we started a principles review process that now reviews just about every research paper, every funding deal for research institutions, every funding deal through google.org, just about every AI funding deal in Google Cloud, AI launches at Google, and evaluates them against a set of principles. Diverse, multidisciplinary experts. So it's not just like, oh, hey, I just happen to be a really good machine learning developer, so I can tell you what's fair. It's like we have sociologists, we have people with human rights backgrounds, people who have deep expertise in different identities who can.
Oh, X, I think we lost you. Yeah, oh, we got you back there.
Sorry about that. I've been having issues before we got on.
That's okay. We can hear you now, so no worries.
Okay, and so now what I do is I run a research team at Google that's focused on computational media understanding. So how can we take data and understand who's represented in it and how? And as Jay mentioned, a lot of the biases that people are familiar with in AI can come from bad data, right? If you put bad data in, your AI system is going to give you bad data out. So when you look at image recognition systems or things like computer vision, which is using AI to see computer vision, right? So movies, videos, those types of things. There's a lot of dimensions where unfairness can happen. There's a lot of really scary research out there right now that assumes statements about you as a person based on your phenotypical features. Like, there's a paper a couple of years ago that was like, we can predict someone's sexuality by looking at their face. And I'm like, what? That is not what a computer is supposed to do, right? Or like, I think there was a recent paper that was published that was like, we can tell your gender by your smell, or just like, there's just like weird things that people are doing with technology we don't want to bring back. So our team really looks at how can we amplify at scale and build and develop tools that help us understand what's in the data, who's represented, how are they represented, how often are they represented. So if we're getting ready to train a data set to do some type of like image search results, or, you know, even just like pixel and our cameras and things like that, that we're able to understand what's missing inside the data up front, use that as a tool to procure. And then also my team is doing a new effort around changing the way that the machine learning industry does skin tone evaluation. Data is just one point where bias can enter. Another is in the metric your model, right? There's a quote that I love that research paper that says the source or method of measurement can introduce bias, right? And so when it comes to skin tone in machine learning models, the industry standard 6-point scale, and the darkest point on this scale is a little bit darker than me and would never be as dark as my grandmother, right? So even if your scale, you know, your model is 100% accurate against Fitzpatrick's scale, it would never work well for Black and brown people. So trying to not just fix the data set problem, but also fix the method of measurement by which we analyze what's fair for skin tone inside of computer vision models. So yeah, that's me, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's great. And you've kind of skipped ahead a little bit. So I want to jump on to follow up there, and then we can maybe backtrack a little. But just thinking about the notion of identifying target variables that are most appropriate to the inquiry. And this was a question that I wanted to put to you and to Jay a little later on, but let's get into it now. So, you know, for example, credit history as a metric for credit worthiness. Setting aside issues as to discrimination, that could be a good metric if you're looking to older people who have a credit history, as opposed to younger individuals for which looking at credit history, you know, really as a metric for that concept of credit worthiness isn't maybe as apt. So I would love to hear from you as to the process and feasibility of identifying new targets as the basis for decision making. And Jay, maybe you could jump in there, and then X, you could take that, because it sounds like there's really an opportunity there to just think about things in a new way. I mean, I think for as long, you know, as at least we've known, people would associate credit history with credit worthiness, just because that's how things have been done. And so I really would love to dig into the process of identifying those new metrics or target variables. And, you know, X, maybe if you could also help us understand in the context of Google, like what goes into that kind of decision making as to how we could think about what new concepts should be representative of what the decision that's trying to be made by an AI.
This is a fantastic and really sort of nuanced discussion, right? So in financial services, there's a lot of regulation, right? And that regulation sort of dictates how we can think about assessing someone's credit worthiness, what constitutes a stable model, and what might introduce safety and soundness concerns to our financial system. And so there are literally dozens of pages of regulation that have been written about sort of what constitutes a valid model. And a lot of that is around sort of maintaining the stability of the status quo. And so when we look at evaluating new data sources to predict credit risk, we're looking from two lenses. One is what's going to be the most predictive of an outcome, like am I going to default on a loan or am I going to repay the loan? But then also what's going to allow progress to happen inside of this highly regulated framework. And so I would love to be looking at all sorts of different data sources, like, you know, to evaluate creditworthiness. But we have consumer protection regulation that says you can only really look at a few different types of data sources that allow consumers to correct them, because in the past there were issues where people had credit histories that were recorded incorrectly, or rumors that were in their credit histories that were propagated by people that didn't like them, or by groups that were against their well-being. And so it's really important to sort of have this balance between the ability for the consumer to understand and correct how models are making decision about an important aspect of their life, how much money they're able to borrow to get a car or a house, but to also include as much information as possible so that the picture of the consumer that's painted by this model, however inaccurate it is as accurate as it can be. And so that's a tension that we have in financial services in particular around the correctability or the inspectability of the data that's used to make a credit decision, and our ability to use it in a decision-making algorithm or a credit score. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. X, do you have anything that you want to add on there as to the process of constructing new target variables when it comes to the things that we're trying to measure?
Yeah, I think there are two things that we tend to consider, and one is, what is the potential misuse of this system? So we have like journeys, right? Like, okay, if this is my target variable, for example, the very famous case study we talk about often with text to speech, where there was a research paper that was easy improvements to text to speech that just, and how likely is it that someone could pick up this source code if we use it, right? And use it for something harmful, use it for something that's against our AI principles if we were to just put it out there in the wild, right? So looking at not just how is this going to benefit us, but what are those edge cases and those corner cases that we may not be anticipating right now, and gate for those up front. And if not, what do we need to shift about the approach we're taking, right? Another thing I think is just when shaping a target variable, especially when dealing with something that have differences, they interact with reality, racial differences, socioeconomic differences, making sure that we communicate with as many of those who are at risk of being harmed as possible before we launch the product, because those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And I myself, I'm Black, I'm a military veteran, I'm just stand here, I can act of all of those communities, or even one of them really well. And so we tend to use our own internal resources. We invite other Google use their lived experience to contribute to some of this feedback. We do intentional UXR with different communities. Make sure thinking about what are your feedback missing? And a famous example of where that didn't happen, the DMV area, DC, Maryland, Virginia, with SNAP benefits. So they built this fraud detection algorithm, right, that was supposed to automatically flag fraudulent transactions on a SNAP network, EBT welfare benefits. But what they didn't take into consideration is the way that people in food deserts shop. And so if I'm in New York and there's a bodega down the street from my house, I might go to the bodega 2 times in a day. If I run out of money and I've been living in the same neighborhood, the bodega owner might grab food and just come back and pay him on the month. I might go to the store for a week. Well, the fraud detection algorithm that they built was built under the assumption that people go to the grocery store once or twice a week, maybe, and that money when they go in one run. Like, they're not going to spend half their BT money in one run. And so what started happening, and this is still an issue today, is that all of those bodega vendors, those people who were vending in these food deserts, started to permanently have their ability to accept vote, because they had solved the solution for one use case, but didn't consider that edge case or that corner case that is a real reality for a lot of people, and the system ended up harming them, right? So that's where it comes into like making sure that we're moving fast enough to move forward, but not moving so fast that we end up harming people in the process. Right?
That's just a tremendous point. Like, and that's a great story. We had an example just like that where the lender was trying to open up a credit product to more people, but the model was trained on data for people who were sort of lower risk. And that the patterns that it learned on that population meant that it had what we call a blind spot. It didn't have statistical support to be able to score the new population that they were trying to score. And so models will give scores. Models, machine learning algorithms will provide probabilities. It's really hard to tell whether those probabilities have any basis in the data or any basis in reality until you actually go through the exercise of assessing the blind spots. And so when we work with lenders, we're really particularly sensitive to this because there are so many people that they've denied that they want to include, but you know, when you don't have data about those people in the training data for the model, your model's going to do something crazy like deny, like turn off UBT for bodegas and food deserts.
So let's, now that we are in the thick of talking about mitigation strategies, I want to talk about a couple more. And so, you know, one X had alluded to a little bit earlier on, thinking about when is more data the solution. So obviously there are trade-offs between collecting more data and privacy and other concerns. There's also the argument that more targeted forms of data can help to improve model accuracy, and that can also lead to outcomes that are more ethics or rights supporting, in addition, create other negative externalities. So that's one potential strategy when we think about mitigating algorithmic bias and designing systems that are more robust and better to kind of speak to the outcomes that we want. So, X, I'll put that question to you because I think that insofar as entities that are in a position to consider that as a strategy, Google would be one, just because of its size and, you know, the scope and reach and everything that it has. And then another strategy that I want to get into is thinking about pre-processing data to remove protected attributes. But I think that it's going to be more helpful for the audience and everyone if we split that. So let's first focus on this piece as to when more data might be the solution. And then I really want to get into this idea of protected attributes and proxies.
I would love to hear Olivia as well, because she as a service. I'd love to hear how she helps companies. Free consulting I get on. I think on what the problem is. For example, the EC vendor, right? Wasn't that they needed more, it's that the even the they chose was wrong, right? Did more data. Said when this happened, it was a bad decision. Fix that, and the way that they, without knowledge of the community and the reality, more data isn't good. If you have something that's under, you know, maybe a disparity in Fitzpatrick's perform, oh, everything except, which is the darkest point. That's probably because they is, you know, of that person to make them. But I also want to push back. The only metric, something that's 90, but that 1% disproportionate or disproportionately if low income people in South, disproportionately if, right, then how extra fairness to precision, recall, is like data in the data set the thing that we need? Is more data in which our model is going, is the users of our model think, feel, and perceive. Also about perception, how the system functions. I mean, if it's so accurate, it'd still be people who'd be like, that's not to me, right? I think data, the way I approach give them, like, the environment model is going to be used, how we reality, people going to feel about, and the way have we done it and be perceived can be the most technically fair.
Yeah. Olivia, would love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think my answer usually catches people by surprise because it sounds very old school right at first, but we actually just start at what's the definition of fairness. Oftentimes what we discover is when we're working with teams, everyone within the team will have a different definition of what they think fairness is and what they think a fair outcome of a system is. And then there's miscommunication even within a team, even within like, for example, when my company when we work with other companies, we have our own little teams of experts. Essentially, there's at least 4 of us per project, and even within my own team, we have to sit down and go, all right guys, what do we mean by fairness? What is the actual definition? And with just the nuances within the definition of fairness actually has implications beyond that. For example, we were working with a client who has a recommendation system. It's kind of like it is a social media app. And there are different profiles, and these different profiles are recommended based off of the topic that they can advise on. Now, we were working with the client, and they're like, we're noticing that we keep having this bias seep into the system, either gendered or racial, but we keep having this bias come into the system. We're trying so hard to make sure that we're mitigating that on the profiles. Like, why does this keep coming back in? We sat down, we're like, okay, well, your definition of fairness that you're working with is making sure that the individual is 1 per 1 on all of the profiles. You're removing the sensitive attributes that have to do with race and have to do with gender. Well, have you taken a look at how your recommendation system is actually filtering topics and what topics it's filtering for? Then it was that light bulb moment of, oh, we did actually mitigate bias. We did make it fair in terms of the profiles were not being filtered or recommended per sensitive attributes, but the topics were the place where bias was seeping into the system. So it just came back to, what are you working with? What are you trying to make fair in the first place? What fairness are you trying to implement into your system? And is that where some of, not the holes, but the blind spots that are coming in that need to be brought to light?
Olivia, I just couldn't agree more. I mean, I think a lot of times we do focus a lot on the data and the input attributes and looking at, are they related to a protected basis or something that we don't want the model to use for decision making. But these models are so smart. They can develop internally to the model. They can develop proxies that correlate with protected basis. And so it's really important also to look at the outcomes. And I think that's what X was talking about with the EBT. It's the outcome that was not the outcome that we wanted. And likewise, in our lending programs, we always are looking for, okay, it looks like, this is going to approve more people overall, but is that increase in approval, is that distributed equally among the protected groups or not? And what can I do about the outcome versus just making sure that all my inputs are clean?
Well, you guys have beat me to it because the next question that I wanted to ask was really focused on proxy variables. And, we have protected attributes, but in commercial contexts, it often makes sense not just to look at pre-processing to limit consideration of those attributes explicitly, but also what might be considered a proxy for those. And that's not necessarily, and maybe even other attributes as well that don't track along traditional lines of discrimination, so considering race, gender, and these other categories. And so would love, and this question is to everybody, your thoughts on in practice how those determinations are made as to what constitutes a proxy for a protected attribute, and when it's something that should be solved for, and when it's something that maybe an edge case where it speaks to the actual functioning of the model being able to make a decision, because we also don't want to remove proxies to the effect of a model that then becomes arbitrary. And I think that that's another concern, can raise another set of concerns, because then you don't have a model that's making decisions on any basis. And so in kind of concluding this section on talking about mitigation strategies, just some thoughts about how you balance those questions and how those decisions really get made in practice.
I'm happy to jump in. You know, in lending, we have guidance, right? So if a variable in the model is a protected basis, you can't use it. But that doesn't mean that the model itself isn't also having disparate impact, where it's approving one group more often than another. And so what we do is we use a technique called adversarial debiasing, which pits one model against the other, to try to kind of coax the racism or the sexism out of the model during the development process. And kind of the important attribute of that in a lending context is that we're not using a protected status as a predictor in the model. So in other words, we're not considering race and ethnicity, gender, or any other protected basis when making a score, but we are influencing the outcomes so that the outcomes are all more fair. And so we've been able to use that approach to work on to implement progressive programs of increasing fairness for some of the world's largest models, trillions of dollars changing hands on the basis of this stuff, and affecting hundreds of thousands of people's lives by allowing them into credit products that they would have been denied for previously.
Very interesting. X, please share if you have any other thoughts there on the proxy question.
Is I think everything there has to be a calculate against the category ancestry and trying to say tone must fit in those categories to society would be considered I'm too light skinned. Right? Proxies slow down and it's really bad model. Okay, I gender is a viewer video. Gender is a how some might perceive gender expression video, and I see a crowd of people who do I think that that's fair? I can't privately held values like race, like sexuality, food, from it. So a lot of false have people with the after social justice world, and a lot of them look at proxy to measure they were helping certain communities. Be using AI to do looking at a picture or looking at it that you're going to be those AI companies like the can't get your dog and they're like measuring and like came off as it and there was tons of racial even in the way that they define what a confident and so I am a things that are backed our zone is not it's not the same thing. The signal of has shown that of that variation then right out of a racial category things like ability to buy marital status like you end up living around even within racial category of those things then for looking at media we have and then light skinned and then say we when a representation and the Afro Latino right to being able to show
Yeah, very, very interesting. So I think that we are so unfortunately coming up on time here. This is always the issue when we have a great group of people, but we only have an hour to speak with everybody. So I wanted to end with a quick question to put to everyone on background and skill set, and really to help impress upon people, whether they're on the side of hiring within companies or individuals who are looking to get into this field as talent, just the truly interdisciplinary nature of the skills that are required to support the exercise of what we're doing here. So, Olivia, I thought we'd start with you here, especially because you've written a very thoughtful piece that let's drop it in the chat. I'd hope everyone would read and should check out. That's on the role of an AI ethicist as a profession. And so, can you help people understand, both on the supply and demand side, some key points from this piece as indicators to both competency and success in being an AI ethicist?
Absolutely. It's definitely a topic that I speak on quite a lot, because the term AI ethicist for a while was thrown around quite easily, and there wasn't much of an understanding of, oh, you're an AI ethicist, you're an AI ethicist. There's a difference between being an AI ethicist and someone with an affinity towards AI ethics, an understanding of AI ethics. It's a big difference. Being an ethicist, I have a certain skill set. It's the same as someone that's a data scientist or someone that's a programmer. I have a certain skill set based off of my capabilities. And that skill set is something of value independent of, let's say, the rest of a team. I am an integral part of a team. Like I tell a lot of people, I work side by side often with programmers. I don't code, but I know the questions and I know the questions to ask my, not sidekick, but it's like my counterpart, where we're translating back and forth to each other. I'm translating values and principles, and my counterpart is translating code and numbers to me, and that's how we communicate. My background is actually in philosophy, and I've definitely said I'm a philosopher to a room of computer scientists and had a couple of laughs. And one person say, well, that's brave to say to a room of computer scientists, but I do stand by it, because what I mean by there being a specific skill set to being an ethicist, and independent even of the term AI, even in the context of AI, being an ethicist means that I have the skill set to identify situations as being ethically laden, meaning they require these in-depth decisions, these longer thought processes. It also means I have the skill set of translating these high-level abstract values that can't be translated necessarily down to ones and zeros, that can be confusing, that kind of float around. There's no concrete black and white answers. I have a skill set in translating that gray area down into the black and white, down into the context. So I can sit here and sit with you and discuss what is the topic of fairness, and then you give me a model, or you give me a certain situation, a certain tech application. I'll go, okay, this is what fairness, this high level meaning of, you know, something being unbiased, or something, or resources being justly allocated to everyone in the process, high level definition of fairness. I can translate it down into the actual context, into the practical decisions that need to be made to carry out that high level principle. So when I'm talking about, again, the situation of AI, the context of AI, I'm bringing that skill set of an ethicist to the context of AI. I'm bringing it out of academia as well, in industry. There's a couple different skill sets needed in that. But especially if you're looking to hire an ethicist, you're looking for someone to help you with that decision making. These are difficult decisions, and there's something called, you have something called moral fatigue. And what that means is you're constantly making moral decisions over and over and over again. And these are hard, difficult decisions. And slowly but surely you get tired, because your mind is running constantly through very emotionally laden decisions. And so by bringing in an ethicist, what you're doing is you're helping alleviate that. You're actually helping someone. It's like bringing in the spotlight and magnifying glass and going, okay, here's the decision you're making, and here are the implications and the potential impacts and all of that. You're not offloading it, but you're offloading a lot of that weight on your shoulders. You're offloading a lot of that heavy mental lifting onto someone that's trained to handle it. And then that person, that ethicist will sit next to you and go, okay, here are your options. Here are the impacts. Here's what I advise based off of what you're telling me for the principles that you're making decisions on. Here's what I advise. So it's a vital position, and I tell people a lot. I mean, right now there's far and few of this, but 5 years from now, people are going to be looking at you going, okay, have you hired on your data scientist? Have you hired on your CTO? Have you hired on your ethicist? It's going to be that integral part of a team in the future.
Thank you. That was an incredible answer. Jay, to close us out, same question to you. Would love to hear a bit about how your skills and experiences have gotten you to where you are, and how you think about the issues.
I'll just say, first of all, I have a lot of respect for the philosophers in the room, because I started off as a philosophy major and decided it was too hard. I had to switch to computer science. And frankly, we owe much of modern mathematics to Plato's Meno. That aside, when we construct our team, we're looking for a diversity of opinions, and we're hiring data scientists, product managers, designers, and business analysts now. And we try to be very deliberate about picking people with a diversity of backgrounds and opinions, so that we don't develop a monoculture that's going to develop algorithms that aren't accounting for differences in perspective. And we try to engage with our customers on a variety of these issues and challenge their assumptions with regard to ethics of the choices that they make with regard to models and inclusivity. And so I think it's just, it's really important to keep the people around you as diverse as possible, so that you're able to incorporate their perspectives into decision making. You end up with a better perspective every time, just like you do in an ensemble model.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think we lost X, but fortunately she gave us a little bit on her background earlier on in the conversation, which is a testament to the diversity of backgrounds and opinions that are in this field. So I am getting yelled at here for time, but thank you everybody for joining. This has been like an awesome discussion, and there's so many other issues we could have gone into, but I hope that people got a taste. And yeah, thank you guys so much for being here. Be well.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.